Let me start by welcoming everybody to today's webinar. My name is Neil Letson, and I'm a member of the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council, and will be your host for today's webinar, where our speaker is Dr. Kathleen Wolf, and her topic is human health responses to trees and nature. But before we move on too far, and I want to acknowledge Katie Donaldson, who you saw her earlier, who is a communications specialist at the University of Tennessee. Good morning, Katie. She's there in the back.
Good morning. Couldn't find my mute button.
But she's kind of behind the scenes. I just want folks to know that she's the one that handles all the webinar pre-registrations, our promotions, notifications, and takes care of all the necessary things behind the scenes to make this possible. And I just want to acknowledge her value to these webinars. Now, some of you have participated earlier on earlier webinars. You know the routine, but we do have some first-time viewers, and I just want to say to them and remind the others that these webinars are part of a monthly series brought to you through a partnership between the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council and the University of Tennessee School of Natural Resources. Our sole purpose is simply to offer you a variety of topics that will deepen your understanding of the importance of trees and hopefully inspire all of us to find better ways to grow healthier urban forests in the places where we all live. If you have any suggestions on topics and speakers for future webinars, please let us know. We always ask you to do that. I just want to make that point as well. Now, our audience has grown over the past few months throughout the state of Tennessee and the U.S. and even other countries. And speaking of this, I'd like to ask you if you would mind sending in the chat room where you're located, and just feel free to tell us that throughout the presentation. We always want to know where you folks are coming from. So before we begin, I am going to turn this over to Katie. She's going to cover a couple of housekeeping items at this time.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, let me get my screen to advance. There we go. If you are on here with an email that is not yours and you have not registered, please take a moment to register. That is how we count credits for CEUs if you would like to get those credits. Also, if you wouldn't mind just putting your name and your certification number in the chat, that's another way where we gather that data for the CEU credits for this webinar. So if you wouldn't mind doing that when you get a chance. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will try to answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And Neil, I think that's it, unless I left anything out.
No, I think we've covered everything. So at this time, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kathleen Wolf, who told me she is semi-retired as a social science researcher at the University of Washington College of Environment, School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. She has published countless papers, articles, and publications that, in my judgment, have made significant and foundational contributions to our understanding of the social benefits and relationships between people and the urban environment. Dr. Wolf is known and recognized for her expertise across the world. And I would say as a person, she's a very gracious person in her willingness to share her knowledge with others, even in retirement, or should I say semi-retirement. So with that, I want to welcome Dr. Wolf and thank her for being our speaker today on today's webinar.
Hey, Neil and Katie, thank you so much for the invitation. And Kevin, thank you for the invitation to be here. And as ever, I have planned way too much to talk about for a 1-hour session. So I'm going to jump into the slides here immediately. And I'll start by saying that all of the content that I'm sharing with you, it's open source. You know, use it if it's valuable to you, the images, the content, and there's a link to a PDF of the slide stack now in the chat if you wish to download that. But I'm going to start with a study that was done in the 1980s. And it's, you probably have heard about this. Roger Ulrich evaluating surgery recovery patients, gallbladder surgery in a hospital, and randomly assigned, some of the patients having a view of a brick wall, others having a view of trees in a nearby green space. And some, from the patient's records then, discovering they spent less time in their recovery, experienced less pain, fewer minor complications, and observations by the staff of better emotional well-being. There was a lot of scrutiny of that study, and some challenge to it. Really, nature, a view of nature, really that sort of effect. But Roger's colleagues, others have continued to do the research, and to the point now where hospitals are actually incorporating nature in how they work with patients. So this is a hospital in Massachusetts. This is a neurosurgery location. Patients coming out of surgery then, they first are looking into the care station where the nurses and healthcare providers can watch them initially. Once they reach a certain point of recovery, that bed and that whole, see that stick there of all of the monitoring devices, all of that turns around so the patient has a constant view of nature from the window. And this is not a light decision. This is a major investment to set up a hospital and a care facility in this way. Extending this another step, more and more doctors are starting to use PARC prescriptions in their practice and with their patients. And PARC-RX America is an organization that offers resources to doctors who become interested in this. The scripts, the sheets that they can use, advice about how to enter this sort of material and content into the patient records. And interestingly, here you are, you see, so here's the equivalent of a medical prescription and a nature prescription. And then interestingly, these collaborations between urban forest managers, parks managers, and a nearby medical facility. So there becomes then a collaborative effort to provide the spaces for the prescriptions, and also then within that medical facility to do the monitoring, to do the evaluation, to see what the effect would and could be for the patients. I call out this arc, this trajectory of change. So this partnership emerged just a few years ago. Roger Ulrich's study was decades ago. What we see now is this arc of acceptance. First of all, the expansion of the research about trees and nature and health, but then the acceptance of it by non-traditional partners, and even partners who not so long ago were like, really? But now they're integrating it. It's on a limited basis at this time, but it is expanding. And they're integrating it into their practices and into their places. Schools, for instance, hospitals and care facilities, as I mentioned, parks that are collaborating with local public health departments, and all of this in an effort to promote human health in, frankly, a very fun way, to be outdoors and to be active. So I just gave you kind of a teaser as to what my primary message here is, and that is, yes, I'm going to recall a bunch of research way too fast, but that's why I provided the slides if you want to go back and look at things in a little with a little more care. But what I'd like you to think about is, what can we do with this research? Who do we share it with? Who do we start to build collaborations with? And I've begun to do that myself, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the presentation. Here are the three main pieces of what I'll talk about. One is, I'll start with some reviews. What is the extent and depth of this research? And then there's so many ways that I could go with it to talk about the detail. I'm going to focus on mental health. And then I'll end with some ideas about policy and planning. How do we, again, roll this research, roll this knowledge and understanding into practices and policies that can have a positive impact in our communities. I'll start with one review. This was done over a decade ago, and yet many people tell me it's still of value as an introduction to the array of nature and health benefits. Green Cities Good Health is a website. And coincidentally, later today, I'm meeting with a representative of the Forest Service. They're providing some funding for me to update this resource. So even though some of the content doesn't reflect the latest research, it's still valuable as an introduction to the array of evidence about human health and well-being from nature experiences and nature exposure. And the way it's organized is you see those topics on the left side, about a dozen topics there. Each of those is represented by a page, a web page, has the title, a very brief overview, some statistical highlights. You can use them in grant applications, you can use them in newsletters and so on. So again, information that's very shareable. And then there's a longer essay that provides detail. More recently, I collaborated with a group of people, and we prepared a literature review about trees, specifically in cities, trees and urban forestry and human health. And this article is open access. So if you wish to download it and read it, there's no paywall. There's no charge for this. So you may want to look that up if you want to get a little more detail here. But here are the highlights. So as with any scholarly literature review, this is the process. You first do a keyword search across all sorts of databases. That generates thousands of articles. Then you review the abstracts and titles. That winnows them down a bit. And all of this being done by graduate students, assisted with graduate students. Such great people to be able to assist with things like this. And then we did a science quality assessment. What is the array of methodologies that are used to understand these nature and health relationships? Our final article set numbered about 200 studies. And then the heavy lifting to synthesize and present those findings in some sort of structured way. And what we did was we used a report that had been done previously that kind of separated out the nature and health research in these three ways. And that is, trees can help reduce harm, right? They can create shade, very important now in this time of high heat during this summer. They can affect air quality, improve air quality, and iTree and other tools have helped to demonstrate that. Then there's restoring capacities. In other words, if you're not doing so well, or your health is compromised in some way, having access to nature, being active in nature can help restore your health capacities. And finally, building capacity. So you might be fine, your environment might be in pretty good shape, but having trees and nature in your environment can help you to build capacity, mental capacity. I'll be talking about that a little bit, improving your physical health, even perhaps providing for or encouraging more healthy birth weight in babies. Fascinating research from around the world showing that women who are pregnant and have more green within a couple hundred meters, couple hundred yards of their home tend to have healthier infants at birth. Fascinating, but now a well-documented relationship. And here's a breakout of the 200 studies across these three capacities, if you will: building capacity, restoring capacity, reducing harm. And then the representation by the number of articles in each of those categories. And not all research is positive. Some of it is negative in its findings. I'll talk a little bit about that. Some of it is neutral or mixed. Often the studies have multiple measures and not all of them trend in the same direction. They're different in scope, in direction, in significance, statistical significance, and so on. I want to call out one that's really important, and that is if you say, for instance, are taking this information, outreaching to healthcare providers, doctors, public health officials, take a look at that bottom bar. This is what we found that was quite interesting. When we surveyed the the medicine article databases, trees and health, pollen, and asthma response came up pretty persistently. What we see is that doctors generally, when they see any articles about trees, they're often about pollen and its negative consequences. All of these other articles about other health benefits are being published in journals that they do not access. Environmental journals, urban forestry journals, landscape architecture journals, sociology journals. They are not seeing that content. So you might have that. I sometimes when I'm in conversations with public health officials and medical providers, I'll start a conversation and by their response, it's like, oh yeah, they haven't seen all of this other research. They have seen these pollen studies where there's little pricks on the skin, and from that they expand, they generalize then to the possible risks of having trees in our neighborhoods without then thinking about the balance or the give and take, the net value of having trees in our surroundings. They also don't know much about how urban forestry managers are now taking pollen into account in tree selection, tree placement, and so on. So mitigating that potential adverse effect. All right, so thousands of articles represented by Green Cities Good Health, 200 studies represented by that survey that focused on trees and urban forestry. You won't talk about all of that detail. So what are some high level messages from those studies that you might share? One is that trees and nature, nearby nature in our communities promotes general wellness. You might be okay, the conditions of your neighborhood might be fine, but having nature promotes general wellness of individuals and communities. But some people are diagnosed with certain disorders, diseases, and so on, and nature experiences offer a degree of therapy for some of those diagnoses. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I focus on mental health. Another high-level message, particularly if you're talking with people in public health, this is a buzz phrase that's out there now: social determinants of health. Insurers and healthcare systems are realizing that waiting until someone comes to the hospital or the provider is very expensive. So how can you get out in front of health? How can you promote positive health? And social determinants of health is a term that acknowledges that, and that more public health officials are working toward. There's a wide array of circumstances that contribute to our health. Access to education, access to good jobs, good housing, and so on. So there are programs that are attempting to incorporate all of that into health promotion. But the matrix for all of that, of course, is the nature. It's the environment. And so only more recently have people who are paying attention to social determinants of health, have they acknowledged this role of nature and environment. So you might keep that in mind. If you're in those sorts of discussions, toss out social determinants of health, trees, nature, and health. And it's part of the dialogue now as people are searching for ways to make our communities more healthy. Looking at all this research, talking to people around the world who are attempting to incorporate nature more substantially in health outcomes, this is what I've come to understand. And this is not framed in a particular article. This is like Kathy's connections, okay? We are aware of the power and the need for good nutrition in our lives. From nutritious home meals, what is served on our kitchen table in an everyday way, the occasionally meals at restaurants. Do we choose the French fries or the salad? I have to admit, I often go for the French fries when I'm dining out. And then there's the memorable feast, a Thanksgiving gathering or family reunion or some such. What I am perceiving is that nature and trees in our everyday environments are not unlike nutrition. We need everyday quality encounters with nature. Every once in a while, a trip to a nice park, a new reserve, that's kind of like that nice meal. And then taking a vacation, going to a national park, going on an adventure, that's kind of that memorable feast. For myself, I have a daughter who's a wilderness guide in Alaska, and we have done some incredible memorable feasts with her, bear watching trips, glacier climbs and such. But for me, my everyday environment, my backyard, the streetscape, a bike ride through my community, that is the nutritious home meal for me and should be available to everyone. Another trend that we see across this research is that nature experiences are important at all stages of our life cycle. I mentioned the infant birth weight studies, young children, the value of nature out and being outdoors, curiosity, creativity, learning social skills as they play and create with others. Middle age, workspace, finding benefits in having nature in our workspace in terms of productivity, but generally health promotion, cardiovascular, respiratory, stroke prevention, and so on. And then older age, I'm moving along on that right side of this image. And we find that, say, Alzheimer's and dementia, fascinating studies coming out about not the elimination of these conditions, but the easing of symptoms and making people's quality of life better as they perhaps have these sorts of experiences. So the entire life cycle, we need those, if you will, nutritious daily experiences of nature across the spectrum. Another recent sort of trend in the research that I'm observing is attention to dosage. So early studies were very much, you have something that's a green experience, be it a park, streetscape, time in your garden, whatever it might be, and then a health outcome. And the studies were often correlational. That is, a statistical linkage was discovered, but you don't know a lot about the detail of what were the influences. More studies are now in experimental way attempting to understand dosage. So how much, how often, what is the value to different people at different ages? So here's a summary of some of the dosage research. And what you see here is that 20 to 30 minutes is a good time to be outdoors. Some studies show stress reduction in a matter of 5 minutes, but I don't think that's very durable. 20 to 30 minutes, you get an after effect that extends for a bit of time. And it's not a one-off. It's not just one time a week, but about 120 minutes a week. So multiple sessions, garden visits. Again, it can be your private garden. It can be a public space. It can be within your community. That's everything from treescape, overhead canopy to actually working in the garden with plants and smaller bits of nature. All right, so those are some high-level messages. Life course, nature, social determinants of health. What is dosage in terms, and again, the dosage is starting to intersect with the park's prescription, where doctors are paying a little more attention to how often their patients are outdoors. But I'd like to turn a focus now. There's so many different things I could talk about within this research, but I'm going to focus on mental health because it's so prominent now, post-pandemic, in addition to a lot of stressors in our busy lives. So let me talk about that a little bit. What we see in terms of mental health remain, again, those two different very general baskets of benefits. General wellness, we see that children perform a little better in school if they have a green campus. creativity. A few studies are revealing that nature experiences during the creative process can help to move ideas and help someone to synthesize ideas and move to product. On the therapy side, attention deficit, hyperactive ADHD in children, some studies done decades ago showing some benefit to kids playing outdoors routinely, depression reduction, and so on. And we have so many mental health challenges. Again, our everyday lives, the stressors of scheduling, of meeting deadlines and achieving tasks in the workplace or school. A number of studies about social media and the consequence of deep attention and frequent attention to social media and possible consequences for mental health. So I try so hard. I know it's not easy. I try so hard to put aside my devices as much as I can, and to balance, or at least balance that time with being outdoors without the device, paying close attention to my surroundings and those beneficial dimensions of nature. Add to that climate change, where the summer extreme heat. Here in the West, where I am located, Pacific Northwest, wildfire, we're looking at the possibility of one of the worst wildfire seasons in our history. Flooding, we're hearing about cases in the Northeast, fast, unexpected flooding incidents, hurricane season. I once lived in South Florida, and what I remember of the hurricane season and how it has now extended both into the spring as well as later into the fall. So all of these also add mental health challenges. All right, what is the research showing us? And again, I'm sharing some of the highlights, some of the more recent work that is experimental. Some of it's correlation, but experimental then it helps to confirm the effect, the causal mechanism that nature provides for health. And in this particular study, people had choice of where they were outdoors and what sort of activity and their scheduling. And what they found was salivary cortisol, and that's a biomarker of stress. You can do from swabs in the mouth, and it's picked up, it's detected there. And what they found in this study is that 20 to 30 minutes, so this is one that suggests the dosage, but they also found greater benefit for those people who were not as active, were not as outdoors as much prior to the study. So there's an opportunity. It's people who are more sedentary, who don't yet realize the value of nature, help them to get outdoors. What are some programs that can help launch them into an outdoor experience that generates health benefit? Here's another experimental study done by Bill Sullivan and colleagues. And what they did was, this was in a laboratory, they showed people images that varied in the amount of tree cover in standard rates, in 10% increments. And then they measured stress response. And what you see then is the red line is that tree cover. So that was controlled, and that's why that line is consistent. But then stress response, it would never be linear in that way because there's variability in how people respond and their physiological makeup. But nonetheless, you do see an arc of stress recovery. So the higher the line means the lower the stress. What I find really interesting is it kind of levels out at about 35, 40% canopy cover. And that's what a lot of organizations are promoting for canopy cover for residential areas. And here we are. Here's a health study that supports that rate, in addition to other ecosystem services such as shade and air quality and so on, and stormwater management. Here we see a number for canopy cover that expresses or that addresses stress response, human stress response. Physical activity, so important. As a prevention for all sorts of chronic diseases. It can help with hypertension. It can help with other cardiovascular circumstances, mental health improvements, and so on. And we need green spaces to do this. I don't know about, I have a gym membership. How often do I get there? Not very often. And frankly, I get bored when I do spend a lot of time there. Outdoors though, place to walk, place to bike, I much prefer that. So what you do as managers and people who promote outdoor spaces that are comfortable, that are safe for walking and for moderate activity, really important for health. But this can't happen. This doesn't do it. And here's a review where they evaluated people who are active indoors and equivalent activity outdoors. And the comparison was those who were outdoors expressed greater feelings of revitalization, increased energy, less depression, less anger, and really importantly, they expressed greater satisfaction being outdoors and more likely to repeat the activity. And that's what's important, is that people build activity into their physical activity, into their lifestyle. And so doing it outdoors may then encourage it to become a habit rather than a one-off sort of thing. And how does walking outdoors have an effect on the brain? One of my colleagues here at the University of Washington, Greg Bratman, has been studying this. And the word he has shared, this comes from psychology, therapeutic psychology, rumination. And this is the propensity for people who are feeling anxious, depressed, and so on, to enter a negative spiral of thought, to continue to think and reinforce negative emotions, negative memories, negative perceived negative encounters with other people. And what he finds is that when people are outdoors, they come out of that spiral. They begin to think of more positive things to counter those, as here, self-referential thoughts, to become more positive in thinking about oneself and one's relationship with the world. And then group walks. Part of the mental health concerns underway now are about loneliness and social isolation, which has consequences not only for our mental health, but our physical health as well. So there are some nations that are developing social activities, including nature, such as walks like this. And again, the combination of being outdoors and routine social interaction with people lowers depression, helps to improve mental well-being, as well as providing that physical activity in a routine way. And now talking about the clinical side of this. So depression, Mark Berman at the University of Chicago did this study where he recruited people who were clinically diagnosed as being depressed, randomly assigned them to two different groups. One group walked around the green route, which is more with more trees, more forest canopy, and then the other group walked around the red route, a similar residential area, less landscape and tree cover. Then after a span of time, I don't remember, it might have been a couple of months, he switched them, crossover. And these crossover studies are really valuable because then you control for the individual characteristics of people that might influence their response. So what did he find? With the green walk, increase in memory and capacity, greater effect size seen for people who are healthy individuals. So we see here that through this experimental approach, there's a clear demonstration of the value of walking in forested residential areas. Really interesting work just coming out of late, not much yet, but great interest in this. And that is, what about, all right, so there are a number of studies that demonstrate healthier baby birth weight if a mother has more green around their home. But what about post-delivery? And some really interesting studies demonstrating that postpartum depression might be reduced, could be reduced if people have more green around their homes. And again, we don't know the causal pathway. What is it in our minds or our bodies? But there are people doing neuroscience and various studies that are trying to tease out those sorts of things. One of the expressions and experiences of nature that's received a lot of research attention, particularly in Japan and South Korea, and now more so in other parts of the world, including here in the United States, is this practice of forest bathing or forest therapy, Shinrin-yoku. And I want to clarify, because there's some people promoting Shinrin-yoku, and it's they let's go for a run in the woods. Let's go for it. It's not exercise. It is walking, but it's more about attention to your deeper attention to your surroundings, invoking all of your senses in the experience of that forest area, and often experience benefits from a guide. There are more and more people around the country, indeed around the world, who offer guide service. And they're starting to be a part of recreation departments, hospital systems, workplaces, and so on. So that might be another opportunity, is to check and see if there are forest therapy guides within your community, and perhaps collaborate with them to offer events where people can come and experience this very helpful practice. Because the research, oh, excuse me, I'm gonna take a little drink of coffee here. Getting a little, okay. Because what we see from the research is a wide array of health benefits. Everything from physiological, well, most of these are physiological, very rigorous research using biomarkers, using experimental approaches, using random controlled trials. Some of the most conclusive and compelling research with regard to nature experiences. And again, there are certified guides. They go through an extensive training process. This is one of the guide training. I think it may be the only one in the United States this time, the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides. And the training is both remote and in person, and includes a practicum that one can do in one's own community. Switching gears here a little bit. So the demands on our attention, what we have to do to focus on everything in our life, scheduling, work. So much of work now is tied to computer screens, deadlines, task scheduling, task completion. And this is unusual in the history of human beings. We have been, until recently, United States, an agrarian society based on farming and agriculture. Prior to that, hunters and gatherers in the great outdoors, relying on our extended environment for subsistence. Here in the Pacific Northwest, as a land acknowledgement, I speak to you from the land of the Suquamish Nation. And the Suquamish now are reviving some of their environmental and landscape food systems. They're creating clam gardens. They're working to protect salmon populations. They're attempting to manage forests more completely for the various foraged foods and materials. And I find this fascinating because it's such a contrast from my life, which is go to the store, buy things, get on Amazon, and so on. Okay, I went off there a little bit, but the point here is that our lives, this intense focus can create, can fatigue us, can reduce our capacity for attention, can reduce our capacity for concentration. And Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, who I studied with at the University of Michigan, studied this extensively, and they offered then through their research the attention restoration theory. And this is the idea that through brief encounters, nearby nature encounters, one can rebuild, one can restore that attention ability and reduce cognitive fatigue. And if we don't, I don't know about you, but after I've been working on the screen, I start to hit blocks, feeling frustrated. Studies have shown that when you reach this point, you may be more impulsive. Impulse control in young people, for instance, might be affected. And we might even become more aggressive towards people around us, workers, housemates, whoever. Well, the Kaplans in their work and those who followed, colleagues and students, have isolated some of the details of environments that help us to restore attention. And these don't have to be big places. These don't have to be long trips, long vacations away from our everyday surroundings, but a sense of being away. So you remove yourself from that desk or from that screen and go into a separate space. And it has some level of extent. It's big enough for you to feel comfortable. And frankly, my back deck with a couple of planters offers enough extent for me for a nature break. Compatibility, there are elements within it that make it comfortable and safe for you. So for instance, there might be seating. The surface treatment is adequate so that people are mobile. And there are hospital therapy gardens that offer these experiences, and they're very attentive to the paved surface so that patients and caregivers can move about readily with various medical devices, pushing your IV stand or whatever it might be. But the key really here for that mental response, I think, is soft fascination. Soft fascination means that there are elements in your environment that draw your attention without effort. You don't have to consciously focus to pay attention to something. And nature has an abundance of soft fascination features. As you can see in this picture, textures, color, water. Water is prominent in the environmental preference literature as something that really draws people's attention. Even the smallest water feature. Wildlife, birds, bird feeders. Why the popularity of bird feeders? I think it has to do with soft fascination and mental restoration. So if you are creating places or encouraging places for people to take breaks, for them to be outside, think about these 4 elements. All right. Last segment of this, and I think I'm doing pretty well on the timing here. Last segment is some thoughts about how this research is translating to kind of bigger ideas, and how do we talk to key decision makers, policy makers, elected officials in our communities beyond saying, look, here's the evidence. Nature is important. You have to support trees and urban forestry. You have to support parks. What else do you bring to that conversation? And that's the crux of a project that I'm now working on with the American Planning Association and with the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center. We're working on a product to convey that greening in our communities should not be this sporadic hodgepodge of a tree planting over there and a park over there and a green stormwater infrastructure bioswale over here, but it should be thought of as a coherent, cohesive system. And there's precedent for that in our cities. Transportation, the image on the left. There you see how transportation officials regard people getting around in our cities. There's the interstate, there are arterials, there's a greenway, and then there are community and neighborhood roads. This hierarchy guarantees delivery of mobility access to everyone, or could be available to everyone in the city. The image on the right are utility systems. While most of it is underground or overhead, we don't pay much attention, but the people who plan and implement utility systems, again, have in mind a complete system, a hierarchy of delivery and or taking away waste as another example. It is time, based on our understanding of the evidence of ecosystem services, including human health, that we think about greening our cities in this same way. And that settles right down to the site level, the parcel level. This is a project that I did with some colleagues at the University of British Columbia. This article is also open access, no charge. And what we did was to integrate climate, trees for climate response, trees for human health response. What might be then the arrangements or the configurations of green within our community? So out of 8, I have a few representations. Thermal refuge being quite prominent now in what we're thinking about. And that is, how do we create groves of trees? Not individual trees and plantings, but groves that provide those shade spaces that people can be in, reduce temperatures, cooler air. And if these groves are large enough and strategically placed, there's actually a buffer effect that extends beyond that immediate vegetation patch. Thinking more completely about how nature is integrated from the parcel level right on up to the full city system level. Another idea that Cecil Canindike is writing and talking about quite prominently now is 3-30-300. And he's used this. It's a translation of evidence he's published about what is the evidence to support this. Again, various biophysical ecosystem services and human health. 3 being everyone should have visual access to 3 trees from their home. Everyone. Then they should also have 30% canopy cover. And it might be less in retail areas and commercial areas, but around residential areas, 30%. And then everyone should have access within 300 yards, 300 meters of a green space, a park, and so on. And this is ambitious. There are very few cities that can attain all 3 of these metrics. But now there are some that are attempting to do so. So it sets a high bar, but it's a recognizable bar that's valuable for planning. And then very importantly, and I really struggled, is this last or is this first in my presentation? And that is the disparities that we see across cities of access to nature and trees. The term that's being used in some circles is nature deprivation. And not so long ago, well, you don't have trees or parks in your neighborhood, no big deal. It's just about beautification. It's about being pretty. No, 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 no. We now understand the deep, deep need for green in our communities and the equity and in access for everyone. And a number of cities have done evaluations of tree canopy in relationship to cultural, socioeconomic, ethnic instances, and not everywhere, but often we see disparities then in where trees are located in relationship to lower socioeconomic circumstances. And then when I talk about this, I often do a little longer presentation about this topic. And immediately there are concerns about gentrification. So that is now really top of mind for people who are concerned about equity and greening, is how to do it without gentrification. And Alessandro Rigolone Rigolon, is a prolific writer about this. If you're interested, you might take a look at his work. He's at University of Utah. So there we are, wrapping this up. I've shared with you reviews, literature, science literature reviews that now number in the thousands of articles. I still on occasion, you know, those casual conversations one has when one moves about the world and people ask, well, what do you do? And they find what this research to be a curiosity or a novelty. And no, it's been going on for 40 years. There's tens of thousands of articles about this. And excuse me, not tens of thousands, thousands of articles, approaching 10,000. And mental health is but one dimension, but particularly important, and one that I'm finding really resonates with people as I talk about the array of possible health benefits for health for people. And now we're at the point where we're at an inflection point where this can be brought with confidence. This can be brought to policy and planning. And that includes attention to disparity and displacement and the various solutions. And overall, then, I encourage you to think about potential partnerships. Here's one example. In about an hour, I'll be on a call with a group in New Jersey. This is fascinating. So it's a youth employment program, and they're doing ecological restoration across various communities in central New Jersey. They received a grant from the State Humanities Department or organization, and they have asked me to assemble scholarly content, information about place attachment, because they do not want these areas that they have restored to be neglected or to not be used by communities. So we will talk about place attachment in the context of ecological restoration. And then they plan to pursue a follow-up grant in the autumn to incorporate elements into their projects that will encourage community-wide place attachment. It's fascinating to me. I'm having so much fun with this. And I guess that's the benefit of retirement. I can agree to certain projects and not to others. So I'll leave it at that. Partnerships. This is the time to rethink who are your partners and collaborators as you work toward promoting and managing urban forestry and trees in our communities. So I'll leave it at that. And we do have a bit of time. Yeah, a bit of time for questions, comments, and suggestions. And Katie, if you could help me with that. Also, I will stay on a little after. 5 minutes is not much time. So if others would like to stay on and continue with some questions, I'll stay here for a bit.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions here. In our divided world, is there any evidence that community trees, programs, and greenscapes improve social cohesiveness?
So there's really two levels of answer to that question. The first is social cohesion and relationship to loneliness and social isolation is becoming of ever greater interest in our communities. And interestingly, I am seeing more and more projects where stewardship of parks, tree plantings, and so on are an effort. A secondary goal, if you will, is to bring people together in a community, is to give them a fairly neutral situation to come together, to work together, to get to know each other in a casual way. Now, the other level of political situation, my hunch, I've not seen any studies about this, but my hunch is that attending tree plantings and maybe doing so by way of invitation. So rather than a volunteer call, all comers, anybody who wants to show up or, register, come on in, but maybe identifying certain organizations that represent kind of a political orientation and very directly inviting them to tree or park activities could help. I don't know, but it's very different than a town hall. It's very different than a debate. There's something about working shoulder to shoulder with people with a shovel, getting your hands dirty, watering plants, mulching them. It's so different from how the verbal interaction can descend way too quickly. So that's a hunch. But in terms of social cohesion, there are people, I'm understanding that there are now planting prescription for social cohesion. People are tinkering with to very directly incorporate social connections within volunteer programs. And I find that fascinating. I don't know if it's been studied yet, but I would guess in 2-3 years, I'll start to see those articles. If I continue to be semi-retired, that is.
Okay, next question here. Are there any obstacles or resistance in working to expand green spaces in disadvantaged areas? If so, how do you respond?
Oh, do we have an hour? Let's see. Highlights of what I've observed and learned. One is collaboration with the community, engagement with the community. And that is recognizing that if one is approaching a community with a tree planting, to recognize that they have other health concerns and to build that coalition of and resources and organizations that can simultaneously address multiple concerns. That seems to really help, is to recognize the voice and the local knowledge of people. As an example, I have a friend who is with the Seattle Parks Department, and his role is to engage communities that have fewer trees. Well, initially, early on, this was years ago, but initially he went in, it's like, okay, we've got trees and we're going to do the parks upgrade, da, da, da. And people said, whoa, 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 whoa. You know what we want? We want sidewalks at key intersections so that our children can walk to school safely. And it was a heads up for him. He tells this story. And so he had to then collaborate or draw in the transportation officials to say, you know, this is an issue. It's a multiple platform. We have to work together with regard to this community. The second part of this is concerns about displacement. You could call it gentrification. And, you know, frankly, in some communities, an upgrade of the economic platform of the community, people don't mind. What they don't want to happen is displacement of long-term residents. And there's some really interesting things emerging. Urban land trusts, local investors, rather than investment coming from large national banks and developers that don't live in the community, localizing development, property tax arrangements so that people are not taxed out of their homes as their home value rises. So thinking about this, not just about trees, but about the various economic and social dimensions surrounding efforts to plant trees.
Next question. How do we convince people of these benefits when we are constantly bombarded by the media about hurricanes and hurricane damage?
Really good question. I don't know the details, but I'm aware of researchers in particularly the universities of Florida state who have been studying trees and hurricanes, windfall, and I believe they have guidelines for tree planting and managing pruning and so on that can reduce wind damage. That doesn't address perceptions, public perceptions. And I'm not so sure. I don't have a good sense of that. What I am observing is that in many communities, when there was concern about trees and branches falling and so on, number one, tree management in many cities has improved so that dead limbs, there's a routine, and also there's a public call-in system so that those situations of hazard can be remedied. The second is, I think, at least in some communities, a growing recognition of the value of trees is more than just being beautiful. And if it's only about aesthetics, then they're expendable for economic reasons, for hazard reduction reasons, and so on. But once a community begins to understand that there's an array of benefit, and much of it is personal, particularly that's why I've resonated to human health. It's a very personal message that can be valuable in these discussions with people. There's greater acceptance of the presence of trees. Slow process, I get it. But also I'll say, Christine Carmichael is, I don't remember, she did her PhD at Michigan State University. And she studied people's resistance to trees in Detroit and discovered that the resistance was not necessarily to the trees, but it was to failure of the local government to follow through on programs. And maybe there's something there to think about, is in these discussions, maybe it's not just the failure, but it's lack of trust in the local government that there will be response when these situations happen. That's kind of a tangent, but Christine Carmichael's work is really interesting with regard to public perceptions of trees and people's willingness to plant and maintain trees.
She had a follow-up question about how to calm people's fears during hurricane season, but I think it's a similar vein to what your answer was.
Yeah, I'm afraid living where I do, and our challenges are wildfire. So we're seeing much more attention to fire-safe landscapes and earthquake, consequences of earthquake. So very different. I would suggest finding someone in the Southeast within the hurricane zone who might be studying and might be better able to respond. Maybe that's another webinar for you.
Maybe that would be a good one. Let's see. We had several comments. I guess if anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat. We did have someone say under the reducing harm section, they saw no mention of noise reduction and wondered if there was going to be more about that in the presentation, but they said noise pollution, in their opinion, is an ignored topic generally.
Yeah. I again, 1 hour to sift the topics that I would speak about. Noise, attention to greening and noise has really picked up in the research, I would say, in about the last 5 years or so. And there are different dimensions of that. One is the buffering or masking of noise. And so more and more people are looking at what is an effective vegetation screen, if you will, for noise. And it height and depth and density of vegetation structure, multiple layering is important. So you could look at that. The second is really interesting studies about noise perception. And that is, if people are in green spaces and there are nature noises, they tend to perceive the external louder noises as not being as loud. So there's a perceptual effect. Some of the research is now evaluating bird song, different types of nature sounds and an effect on biomarkers, physiological biomarkers. So I think I read a study. I believe I read a study, it might have been from Hong Kong or Singapore, where a parks organization was actually piping in nature sounds into a park place in order to encourage those benefits. I hope I'm not making that up, but I see that potentially is happening, particularly in very dense residential settings and places where there are tiny parks where you maybe don't have the extent of space nor the habitat that would provide for birds, other wildlife, and if you will, ambient nature sounds.
I believe those are all the questions I currently have. Neil, is there anything else you wanted to add or ask?
No, other than Kathleen, this was a fabulous presentation. I can't believe you compacted all that information into a coherent presentation. Such a short amount of time is really amazing. But looking at the comments, they're highly positive, and I think you've stimulated some interest and hopefully some follow-up action at the community level. And with that being said, if any of you out there have been inspired by Dr. Wolf's information to take some action, if y'all were successful in changing policies or implementing new programs, we'd love to hear from you and give you a chance to share that with the rest of us. So Kathleen, you continue to inspire and encourage. Just really grateful for your time and for your presentation.
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you to your organizations for hosting.
Great. Okay, Katie, we have a couple of slides to show at the end. Hopefully folks can stay on, just stick around for another minute or so.
Yes.
Talk about next month's presentation and also an opportunity for them to support this webinar.
Okay.
All right, you may want to talk about that, Katie. Just remind people.
Yes, if you did not submit your name or certification number in the chat, or if you did not register but logged on at the beginning and stayed through the entire webinar, please send me your information if you would like an ISA CEU for joining this webinar. And then let me just advance this slide. There we go.
Okay. Yeah. As just want to remind folks that our goal is to provide these webinars free of charge to you, and we intend to keep it that way. But if you would like to support us in our webinar series and continue to attract excellent speakers like Dr. Wolf, you have an opportunity. You can contribute any amount that you feel appropriate. Just use that QR code, and whatever you can contribute, we would appreciate. It will go into a webinar fund only, and that would be used just to improve this series for your benefit. So I encourage you to do that. Leave it up there just a second if folks time to pull out their smartphones. And then we'll talk about our next month's speaker. Okay, Katie,
All right.
let's advance. There we go. Next month's webinar is scheduled for August 17th and will feature Dennis Bishop, who owns a landscape design company, and he focuses on native plants. And I know that's an interesting topic across the country and the world, and he'll have a lot to offer from his experience and his wisdom. So really encourage you to sign up for that one. It will qualify for an ISA CEU, and you can register shortly after, I guess today, Katie, but we're looking forward to hearing from Dennis. So with that, that's the conclusion of our webinar. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate the time you've taken out to participate, and with your questions and comments, we value those. And Kathleen, I want to thank you once again for an outstanding presentation. And you can stay semi-retired, but we don't want you to pull out of speaking to us and helping us learn even more in the future. But we really appreciate you. So long, and y'all stay safe and keep cool.